It means, of course, that he thinks for himself, and he challenges everyone that he meets to think for themselves, and so he's going to give us a great presentation. He's been here before, and I'm very happy to introduce Mike Nichols.
Guys heard, just listening to biochemists and physicians and everything else talking about the very, at some level. Okay. Oh, I can talk louder. I was afraid I was too loud. As many of you heard earlier when we were talking about a relatively simple problem, which is parathyroid disease, it got very complicated very quickly. And what I'm going to do is very arrogantly advocate humility, okay? And the humility that I'm going to advocate is we don't understand any of this stuff at any fundamental level. But we have a narrative that will create a picture and based in truth that if you will understand and accept that narrative, it'll make sense out of all of this stuff. That narrative goes like this. We are migrating, hibernating, omnivorous hunter-gatherers. And every single one of those things matters. The fact that we're migratory tells us a lot about the physiology of our body's response to exercise. The fact that we are hibernating animals tells us an enormous amount about diurnal and seasonal variations in hormone levels. In other words, the cyclicity of our apparent or transient states of health and illness are linked to the fact that we are hibernators. Now, so I'm going to make that assertion. I'm going to arrogantly assert that we need to be humble, and by being humble, I'm going to tell you we aren't going to understand all the mechanisms that regulate ion transfer. And that just because we know how a GLUT4 transport works in terms of glucose transport or potassium pumps, there's many kinds of potassium pumps, for example, that we know something important, and thank God we've learned a lot, and we will continue to learn more. But in point of fact, health is so complicated, we can't know enough to make a difference. And because of that, if you will adopt this, by the way, part of being sick is my pants don't stay up. Forgive me for that. Because of that complexity, the power of this picture that we are migratory, hibernating, omnivorous hunter-gatherers is how you have to really think about everything you do. When you sleep, when you eat, when you exercise, when you relax, when you have fun, if you will keep that kind of fundamental biological truth in mind, you will adopt the right kind of behavior, dietarily, exercise, relaxation, fun, choice of career, where you live, will grow out of that. And once you've done that, regulating all those potassium channels isn't a problem. The body is smarter than we'll ever be. And so these silly little aphorisms belong on a little sampler on the wall, or the body wants to heal, the body always makes sense, things like that. And understanding those will inform a lot of the choices. Now, that's the background. Migratory, hibernating, omnivorous, hunter-gatherers. Okay. Now, with that as a background, arrogantly asserting humility, I'm going to go through many of the points I'll make are well known and well understood to many of you. But I'm just going to kind of walk through some conventional points. You, for example, mentioned cholesterol, and I'll kind of dismiss cholesterol, quite frankly. And I'm going to dismiss a bunch of things people attend to, and have you notice some other things that grow out of that image that I talked about. All right. Addressing the errors of conventional wisdom. When did that happen? I've got a problem here. I didn't know I had. Uh-oh. That wasn't there a minute ago. Let me see if I can. There you are. Okay. Still not quite. Simple propositions, anybody knows, you don't even have to know Wilfrid Sellers to know these things. Things once thought true are later learned to be wrong, or refined. Newtonian physics, flat earth, obvious simple examples. What is widely believed to be true is called common knowledge or conventional wisdom. Old mistakes are replaced by newer insights very slowly, taking decades to be updated in the public's awareness. That's a study that comes not necessarily from the philosophy of science, but just thought in general. That's an understanding of intellectual history. When you learn an idea, it needs to be carbon dated. What's the date of that idea? Anytime anybody tells you something, you say, well, you know, how old is that idea? Where, you know, how new is that idea? What's the history, the genealogy, the natural history of that idea? I would encourage you to all be students of the information that you're given. And go to primary sources, and remember that even within the most advanced fields of science or thought, we're all dealing with data that's not synchronous. You know, an idea from 1912 is mixed up with an idea from 2008, and that asynchronicity makes it an incoherent whole, and we all live in this state of incoherent wholes. And that has to do with, so I don't know, what am I talking about? Be clear about the genealogy of the ideas that you use to make your decisions. This is very important, and after all, it is your life that we're talking about. Observations. The sun on the east sets on the west, planets move across the sky, the earth is the center of the universe. Here's one everybody's already figured out. Another example of that, fat is found in arteries. Eating fat causes fat in the arteries. And that's, how many times have we been told that? So terrible category error. It's like saying that if you're in a garage, you're a car. There's just not, it just ain't true. And quite honestly, on the face of it, once you've dug into it a little bit, there was never any reason to believe they were related. But it's an example. Now, I'm going to make some points about medicine that probably are near and dear to many of you people who are scientists. Medical practice is the application to large populations of the long-rehearsed guidelines of conventional wisdom. Medicine is a guild. Keep that in mind. And it's a good thing, by the way. You don't want a bunch of cowboys out there figuring out what you should take in the morning if you've got, you know, malignant hypertension or out-of-control diabetes. So there is something important to keep in mind. Medicine is a guild. Science today moves so quickly that the old guild model of medical practice is no longer adequate. That's why you get brilliant observations from people who are biochemists and so on and so forth, and most physicians, if they believed it, wouldn't know what to do with it. And I'm not sure across large populations, those scientists who make those observations even know what to do with it. But guild, medicine is a guild. If you've forgotten what a guild is, it's where a bunch of people get together and agree about the rules of behavior, and they teach it to their apprentices. Okay, conventional wisdom or cutting-edge science. Cost of conventional wisdom. Potentially one's life. Don't know quite how to fix this. It's a new computer to me. Yeah, it's a new computer to me. Hold on. My energy's so low, I'm just reading it. Why don't you do it? I'm sorry. Whoops. I'm getting all these things out of my pocket now. Shouldn't have sat down. Cost of conventional wisdom. Oops, I got ahead of ourselves here. Advantages of guild medicine. Uniform standard of care, tried and true, teachable, less requirement for quality providers. Now, and that's not to say that your physicians aren't all great. It is to say that they're not the very best. I don't care who you are, and me included, the very, very best don't go into medicine. Just the way it is, because you're not. I mean, it's a guild, and it's a service, and it's a virtue, and I'm very happy to be a physician, by the way. But again, they're guildsmen, and this is the nature of a guild. Okay, uniform standard of care, tried and true, teachable, less requirement for quality providers. Disadvantage of a guild: uniform standard of care, tried and true, path of least resistance. Teachable, less requirement for quality of providers. Economic inertia, can be wrong behind the times. Okay. When to use a guildsman. In other words, there's a place for a guildsman. for single point problems. And this is the distinction. When you think about what's my problem, if you want a guy who's removed 1,000 gallbladders, and he knows everything about removing gallbladders. You don't want him to guess. Perform a bypass operation, treat respiratory failure, reduce your worn out hip, replace, undertake an angioplasty. Here's examples where you do not want a Gilsman. And it's not a failure of most physicians to not be good at this. It's the nature of these problems, that they are multivariate problems. They are not single point solutions. They're complex interactive things reflecting multiple things having gone wrong. And you need somebody who knows how to think and deal with that kind of complex data set. It's a math problem. That's what I'm just restating what I've just said. I'm sorry, just restating what I've just said. You want a Gilsman for single point problems. You don't want a Gilsman for complex problems. Quite honestly, all of the problems that you think of in terms of aging, all the problems that you think of in terms of degenerative change, these are complex multivariate problems. They are not best treated by a Gilsman. Wrong. These are wrong. If you have any questions about them being wrong, my opinion is they're wrong, okay? So, narrow arteries cause heart attacks. As you probably heard a statistic, 85% of all heart attacks do not occur at the site of a narrowing. Eating a low-fat diet is good for you. There's a lot of reasons that isn't true. It isn't true. We'll argue about it later if you'd like to. I'm asserting it's wrong. The lipid hypothesis, which is what he was talking about, cholesterol causes heart attacks. It's been disproven from so many different angles, it's even hard to think why anybody would stand up in public and advocate it. And the way you pick the data apart and even hold it up gets interesting. So that was this bag of worms I think someone referred to. But that is not how you should think about your risk for heart disease. Aerobic exercise is good for you. Anybody believe that one? No? All right. Calories consumed plus minus calories burned equals weight gained or lost. Anybody believe that one? Really? Well, that one's the one I get everybody to go for. What that one's saying is that if I eat more than I burn, I'll get fat. If I eat less than I burn, I'll get skinny. Does anybody believe that? Oh, you guys have got to believe it. Everybody believes that. Ain't true. Wrong. Okay. I'll explain that too. Supplements are good for you. Now, this is the throne of supplements right here. We are in the holy of holies when it comes to supplements. Oxidation and oxidative stress is bad for you. Anybody believe that? You got to have it. The obvious and foolish example is that the cessation of oxidation is death, and you probably all know that. It's called breathing. Body mass index matters. A lot of people are concerned about their weight or body mass. Anybody believe that? Okay. As you may have seen, the most recent issue of Archives of Internal Medicine had a nice article. It's just a reiteration of research that's been shown many times, and that is 50% of the obese are healthy, 50% of the thin are sick. In other words, you can't tell by looking, okay? So the goal of losing 10 pounds and all my problems will go away or be improved is not true. This, again, is very powerful statistical evidence to support this. I'll be glad to talk about it in more detail. Heart attacks always occur at the site of narrowing. So I'm going to take some of these errors. As I already mentioned, that 85% occur at an unnarrowed area. Atherosclerosis is a whole body disease. Stents at best are a band-aid. Scientific approach reverses the effect of the disease. There's a very famous man you've all heard of named William Harvey in 1625 said, "You're only as old as your arteries." And a brilliant man 400 years ago knew what we are just now beginning to understand. The fact that you had a heart attack can be tragic. It's certainly inconvenient, but that ain't your problem. Okay, your problem is you've got a disease in the arteries of your body, and that you want to understand. And okay, we'll leave it at that. A healthy diet is a low-fat diet. High-fat diets cause cancer. That's another one I hear a lot about. Anybody believe high-fat diets cause cancer? No? You got it. If they're polyunsaturates. Yeah, I wouldn't be more worried about rancidity in the polyunsaturates, but yeah. Okay, you guys, I knew you guys were smarter than most of these things, but anyway, okay. High-fat diets cause fatty buildups. Eating fat causes people to get fat. That's my favorite mistake. Have you guys all read Good Calories, Bad Calories? Anybody read that book? Gary Taubes, you should read that book. It's a good basic rehearsal of, he's talking about fat and the myths around fat, but what it really is a great cautionary tale about the corruption of science by politics. And the corruption of science, well, science can corrupt itself nicely, so it doesn't need any help from politicians, but it's a beautiful story about how of such a fundamental science as obesity within a population was corrupted by a political process. In '72, the McGovern Commission set a percent fat goal for Americans of 30%. By the way, if you don't know that, that's about what the percentage of the American diet is right now. Okay, in other words, we achieved it. Now think how many billions of dollars in public awareness announcements and propaganda and anything else you want, your government, your CDC, your doctors in medical school have been telling you that it was eating 50% of fat calories were causing all these problems. The net effect of reducing the American calories from fat from 50% to about 30% has been obesity and increase of general atherosclerotic disease. Now, that's association, that's not cause, but in point of fact, it is cause. Now, this is just some other interesting points about the cancer connection. One of the favorite demonic foods in alternative medicine is dairy. And the Swedish mammogram cohort study is one of my favorite studies to get rid of anybody's concern about dairy. In the Swedish mammogram cohort study, there were absolute inverse relationships between the amount of dairy consumed in breast cancer, colon cancer, and, well, the breast cancer was less vivid, but colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, and atherosclerosis. As a matter of fact, at the higher range, I could only imagine these people were living on cheese. I mean, and it's still inverse relationship. Yes, sir.
Is that Swedish?
It's a very good point. Absolutely good point. Very good point.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Consider may or may not be full of
but it's not. But in any event, it's not about
and pus and all
absolutely right. Absolutely right. But the point, it's not dairy that's the culprit. It's certainly the manufacturing process. I'll support that in 1,000 different ways. Okay. But I'm trying to take away the notion that it's the dairy itself. There's no, the coronary artery disease in young adult called the Cardia study. Now this isn't Swedish.
The bullet doesn't kill you, it's the displacing the flesh of the brain.
That's right.
You know, yeah.
Here's the point. The Cardia study, which was a United States, I was going to get to that by the way. The Cardia study, which is a United States-based study, a multi-center trial looking at dairy's association with all of the lipid disorders, hypertension, atherosclerosis, diabetes, etc., showed also an inverse relationship between dairy, American dairy, as bad as that is, and all of those variables. Now the Cardia study is still an ongoing multi-center trial looking at lots of variables, but the dairy data has been studied, or has already been published. What was interesting, and it was kind of fun, if you read the comments, they made a sort of a backhanded disparaging remark about blacks because they said, oh, you know, they eat a lot higher fat diet. The higher fat, they don't eat as much low fat dairy as whites. And they couldn't figure out why that hadn't killed them off. But in any event, the point was the dairy was inversely related in American studies with American dairy with diabetes, insulin resistance by another measure, hypertension, and eventual evolution into diabetes. And that was a very large, well-done multi-center trial.
Does that mean ice cream's okay?
If you can find it without sugar, have all you want. That's right. I agree with that. This is, again, since you guys are already on to the fat, some of this you've already heard, but the Maasai and Inuit eat extremely high-fat diets. And they have almost no degenerative disease in general when they're on their native diets. IRS, by the way, means insulin-resistant syndrome. Insulin-resistant syndrome is that 20, yeah, well, I worry about the other IRS too. Now, the insulin-resistant syndrome is kind of a statistical category of those who have about the top quintile of insulin in response to diet. They're the 20% of people who get 80% of things that are wrong. Okay, so The IRS is not association, but now a known cause. Now, the point of my making this point is that we know people in that highest quintile of insulin insensitivity have a 20-fold increased risk of liver cancer and not infectious. As a matter of fact, the biggest category increase in liver failure is in what's called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. In other words, their liver failed because it's been poisoned by sugars. So colon cancer, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, all forms of atherosclerosis, hypertension, diabetes occur to that 20% of the population, and which is an entirely behavioral disease, by the way. Low-fat diet increases your risk for diabetes, cancer, and aggressive aging. Okay, this is the lipid hypothesis that we've all grown to know and love. I won't, because I know it's late, I won't go through this if you want. I have data from that good old medical literature, which nothing in the medical literature supports the lipid hypothesis in any meaningful way. One of my favorite examples was published in Lancet in December of 2007, where this is the largest pool. It was a meta study of cholesterol and stroke. And it clearly showed an inverse relationship between cholesterol and stroke. In other words, the higher your cholesterol, the lower your stroke incidence. And this was very upsetting to them. They did not want to find that. This was, by the way, it was 60,000 dead people. So this wasn't 60,000 subjects. It was 60,000 people who died. It was a huge study. And there was in the normal intensive population from this study, the higher your cholesterol, the lower your stroke incidence. And this is just what it said, okay? And he was right when he remarked to you, I think, about cancer. There was a clear, you mentioned that, there was a clear increase in, but interestingly enough, also suicide. So depression goes up with low cholesterol as well. Anyway, this particular study, the Lancet study, was total cholesterol. Yeah. I've got some others that I've gotten here, and again, because I think we're probably later than I thought. I won't go through all of them, but I've got files and data, and that's what these figures are if you ever want to see them. I'm sorry? It was in Lancet. That's a British journal, Lancet. It was December, I think it was the second week, I'm not sure, but December 07 is when you can find it. Yes, sir?
And what about subfractions of LDL?
Well, the Lancet study didn't look at that.
What do you think, though?
Well, I think it's very important. But again, it's not cholesterol, and I know you know that, but it is not cholesterol. That is low-density lipoprotein. When the most healthy form of low-density lipoprotein has more cholesterol in it rather than less. Keep in mind that the low-dense small particles, and this is probably a topic you guys have heard something about, the small dense LDL, in fact, have less cholesterol in them than the large low-density LDL. So the amount of cholesterol is just not the issue. The fact is we've got this word game where they tricked us. They take high-density lipoprotein, low-density lipoprotein, and a sixth of your triglycerides, and they call that your total cholesterol. It has very indirectly anything to do with the cholesterol molecule itself. But yes, I do think that subfractions are important. But I'm just quoting just general lipid. You've got to remember the lipid hypothesis was high cholesterol kills you, and it just hasn't been shown to be the case. By the way, this is kind of one of my favorite ones. I spoke with the primary investigator on the heart protection study, which is the largest primary prevention trial in England, or secondary prevention trial, in other words, after you had a heart attack. And his advice to the British Health Service is quit checking people's cholesterol. It doesn't have anything to do, so it's not like people don't know this stuff. His reason for telling the British Health Service not to check cholesterol is that its effect in his study, the largest study done in England, at least in the British Isles, didn't show any correlation between the degree of lowering and the benefit of Lipitor. And let's be very clear, there is an advantage to statins. They do, in fact, lower, about 28% is the summed average, your risk of heart attack, or second heart attack after you start taking them. 28% is also the same amount you can reduce it by taking a handful of peanuts 3 times a week, which is a lot better for you and a lot easier, a lot cheaper, a lot less likely to be toxic. Yes, sir?
Peanuts?
Yeah.
Also well-known antifungals.
Absolutely right. No, that's correct. All the antifungals are cholesterol. That's right. That's sterols. Yeah, that's right.
There's also a pretty good theory that high cholesterol is a result of fungal contamination or
Well, it's connected. I think there are plenty of other causes that will account for why some people get high cholesterol. In fact, well, you're right. Fair enough. Did everybody get, yeah, peanuts. Why peanuts? That just happened to be a study somebody did, and that made it to JAMA, which is a big-time journal. It wasn't a handful, I don't remember the exact number, but it was a reasonable amount of peanuts 3 times a week in that study showed just as high or as much a reduction in second events as did the statins. It's in the journals. I mean, it's amazing how much of this stuff's out there, and you still say, how does this gill keep grinding on? Yeah. Well, anybody taking a baby aspirin? Because, listen, I'm sorry?
not in a while.
Yeah, right.
Since I was that small.
That's right. I guess we shouldn't call it that anymore. Cardioprotective aspirin, 81 milligrams. Pardon me. Oh, by the way, you did get the side effects of the statins, right? Memory loss, depression. It can be it's pretty nasty stuff.
Red rice yeast.
Same thing. I mean, you got to remember, it's all that's the same thing. It's an HMG-CoA reductase inhibitor. That's what's in red rice yeast. Same thing. It's just called Mevacor. I mean, if you want to take that, you want to quit synthesizing sterols, go for it. But why would you want to do that, since that's not the problem? You want to lower your cholesterol. Go for it. I don't think there's any point to doing that. I think his points of merit. Why did mine go up a bunch? Why is it continuing to go up? You care about that. Remember the first thing when Professor Miller here was talking about trends and tracking? That's what's interesting. When you've got a guy who had a cholesterol of 140 all his life and it's now 400, something's going on. I want to know about that. I don't want to just lower his cholesterol. On the other hand, my mom's 90, she's chasing her third husband, and her cholesterol's been 400 all of her life. All right. Aerobic exercise is good for you. Anybody old enough to remember in 1968, Dr. Ken Cooper published a book called Aerobics. He invented that word. He was a very fine high school miler, by the way. He was a darn near 4-minute miler. Now, this is back in the 50s. So he thought, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So he thought running was the cure. And I don't want to be, I agree with him, running can be the cure, but what most people have adopted is sub-maximal endurance type behavior. That's very different than in point he was actually advocating it was ever understood to be. There was another article recently in, I think that was Archives of Internal Medicine too, that showed they took a runner's club, a true runner's club, and they followed them for a long time, and they did have a lower incidence of mortality. But again, they weren't your joggers, and that's what I want you to understand. Sub-maximal, yes sir?
Are you also putting, for example, Frank Schallenberger's observations about over aerobic exercise versus tuned aerobic exercise, lumping it in that same category?
The problem is aerobics isn't what's helping. You want to be anaerobic. Everyone, look here, where I'm going with this is this. Let me give you a nice, clear statistic. It's a reference point. A 60-year-old male with a VO2, that's volume of oxygen, of 25 milliliters per kilogram per minute, is 3.5 times more likely to have a stroke than a 60-year-old with a VO2 of 35. Now, VO2 sounds like aerobic, we're talking about oxygen. You achieve an improvement in your aerobic capacity by anaerobic training. Now, I don't want to get too far off on that unless you want to in question, but the fact is, where does this happen? Where does oxidation occur? It occurs in the mitochondria. It's a simple oxidation reduction chain of, big deal. It's a respiratory change on the mitochondria. Take oxygen, take carbon, makes carbon dioxide. In the human world, unlike in the automobile world, Ferraris live longer than Hondas. You want to be a fuel-wasting, spendthrift fool when it comes to biological energy. And the way you do that is by increasing the aerobic ceiling on your cells, which requires positive adaptive demand beyond current mitochondrial capacity. So you have to do what these guys labeled simply enough from the other day. Yeah, you want to do some interval work, and that's exactly right. So the going out for a jog. Now, by the way, remember I started the story by we are migratory people? We are designed to be so efficient at submaximal ambulation that in point of fact it's designed to turn off our metabolism. If we as a hunter-gatherer community, we've hunted and fished and snatched everything out of the local ground, we have to migrate as a clan. We have to be able to get there, and if that was a fuel burning, wasting enterprise, we wouldn't get there. So in point of fact, what's called eccentric exercise, I can get into that if you want to, actually down-regulates the metabolic capacity of your walking muscles. It turns it off. So you'll get to the next hunting ground, next gathering ground. By the way, one of the stories I didn't mention was about why inflammation was far more powerful as a predictor of heart attacks than cholesterol. Turns out inflammation is a healthy response. We're supposed to have an inflammatory response, and I don't mean in some generic sense when we get injured. Since we are hibernating animals, what you need to know is that bear, before he hibernates, his inflammatory markers are through the roof, his insulin is through the roof, his triglycerides are through the roof. He looks like a guy waiting to have a heart attack. And then he adopts the perfect cure, the thing that cures everything, starvation. Starvation cures disease. But it's part of the cycle of his life, and we've lost that connection to that. So when we have inflammation, get your jaw wired shut for a couple months, you won't have any inflammation left. It'll be gone. Now, I'm not recommending that. I think starvation is not a good long-term strategy for me, at least. I love food. But the point is, if you keep in mind, we're these migratory, let's think about the energetics, the energy, the calculation, the equation of migration. We're hibernation. What's the biology of hibernation? How can we use that instead of suffer for it? We're omnivorous. We can talk about B12 existing in the bacteria on the outside of carrots, and that's how Jainists in India don't die at 23. But we're not vegetarians. We're omnivorous. So figure that out and do that right. Now, he's right. You don't want to eat over-processed milk or anything else, but that doesn't mean milk's bad for you. Hunter-gatherers, that means we've got to have a variety of foods from a variety of sources over seasonal variation. It's how we're made. Yes, sir. Can't quite get there, huh? Yeah. Well, there's various degrees of hibernation, as you know. Let me give you proof that we're hibernating animals. Babies born in the winter, I happen to be a February baby, they're the worst babies, have a higher incidence of mental disorders, psychiatric disorders. Why? Because we're not supposed to be born in the winter, right? We're supposed to be spring lambs, because, seasonality is a part of our biology. I don't know about you, but man, when it's dark out in the middle of winter, I just want to stay in the bed for a while. Do you ever have that feeling? When it's sun up, boom, 5 o'clock in the summer, I want to get outside. We have photoreceptors all over our body. Literally, our white and red cells have photoreceptive activities. We are light-driven. Now, if you look at our stress response, the old saber-toothed tigers out there to get us, cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up. Cortisol makes us, now forgive me, I don't mean this quite as crudely as it is, but I want to illustrate something. It makes us fat and stupid, make us go lie in the back of the cave and not do anything. It's a stress response. Why? Because part of that hibernation cycle is to retreat from danger, retreat from self. That's part of our physiology. The fact that I have a mean boss has my cortisol high all the time, that's out of whack, right? But it's still a healthy response to this other environment for which we were created, evolved. I don't care. I mean, that's a loaded term to many people. Evolved. And so that's the hibernation part. Again, keep in mind that hibernation, Even within animals we would ordinarily think of as hibernating, they don't go in densely and sleep for 3 months. That's one end of the spectrum. And then there are other ends of the spectrum who, you know, some of the lower phyla don't sleep at all. But somewhere between you don't sleep at all and you sleep for 3 months, we're out here on this end, a lot closer over here than we are over here. So it's a spectrum. Does that help? Does that clear that up? No? Okay. Yes, sir.
It's also true that melatonin
Yes.
has an effect of lowering our body temperature.
Absolutely.
It's a mini hibernation. It happens
Absolutely right.
actually once a night.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely right. And it's also a powerful antioxidant, blah, 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 and drives down GABA. And I mean, yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, sir. Yes.
What do you mean by dynamic anaerobic?
Well, yeah. Okay. The effective kind of exercise that improves mitochondrial function. By the way, the mitochondria, I'll make sure I answer your question, but I've got to take this little side answer to the point about oxidation. Mitochondria is evolution at warp speed, okay? The mitochondria have been confusing to people for a long time because the mitochondria has this design flaw, right? Maybe not, where its genetics are exposed, I mean literally welded right next to this huge oxidative force that just tears up the genetics of the mitochondria. Well, we have, you know, billions of cells and average of thousands or so of mitochondria per cell. And what we have is this dynamic evolutionary force going on within all of our cells if we create enough oxidative stress. You create enough mitochondrial oxidative stress, and then you will get a positive adaptive change in your mitochondrial population. It's one of the cases where you have a large enough statistical sample to actually get positive evolutionary change within your own lifetime, within your own mitochondria. But that's a mathematical calculation. The bottom line is, what it boils down to is you want your mitochondria to get better at their job. The beauty of the body, remember I said I want to be arrogant enough to advocate simplicity or humility. The body will, if you ask the right question, the body will give you the answer you want. I want to have better mitochondria. All right. You ask them in the right way, and how you do that's this. The kinds of exercises will either make your cells have more mitochondria or less. Now, let me illustrate. When a muscle gets shorter against resistance, that's called a concentric exercise. When a muscle resists getting longer, that's called eccentric exercise. The dominant eccentric activity that we do is walk. The quadriceps and other muscles of ambulation are resisting getting longer. My legs are keeping me from falling down. Gravity is what propels me. This is the physics problem. Can you see that? Now, if I were to dash over there, my quadriceps would be getting shorter, and they would be propelling me over there. It's the physiology of sprinting and jogging are just, they're as opposite as it's possible to be. Now, eccentric exercise turns off your metabolism so that we can migrate. Come on, guys, we got to go to new hunting grounds, new gathering grounds, okay? And if I burned up all my calories getting there, I wouldn't get there. So to get to your question, what kind of exercise? I want concentric exercise. I want exercise where my muscles are getting shorter against resistance instead of resisting getting longer. So I want concentric exercise. Now I use the word dynamic. The other thing that it has to be ballistic. It has to be explosive. It can't be continuous. It can't be chi running. It has to be ballistic exercise. Concentric, ballistic, okay? Now, here's where it also gets fun. It has to recruit my endocrine system. Everything acts locally on the nanometer scale, regionally on the millimeter to centimeter scale, systemically on the centimeter to meter scale. Now, All my little joints have got proprioceptors, position sensors in them. And those some go back up to the spine and the afferent signal to the spine. And if it's just that, there's not much firing. If it's that, there's more firing. If it's that, everything's firing. The spine is firing. The spine is saying to the brain, well, it's shouting at the brain, and the brain's conclusion proper is, this guy's crazy. He wants me to be faster and stronger than I am right now. So, hypothalamic pituitary signal turns on growth hormone, turns on testosterone, turns on prolactin, or whatever's needed to respond to this neurological signal. So it has to be concentric, has to be ballistic, has to be whole body. So if you go into one of those gyms and you see this huge array of equipment, avoid it. Just like you would if you saw any food with a health claim on it. If you see any food with a health claim on it, do not eat it. If you go into a gym where it's got an array of selectorized equipment, you know, I call that curls for the girls. It won't help you. You might like it, it's kind of fun, but it's not what you're after. So, concentric, ballistic, whole body, because that's how you recruit the hormonal response. That's how next point is I want to get my mitochondria going. So that's why it has to be intense, maximal interval demand, so that I tell my mitochondria, I want you to be better at your job than you were before we started. Now, you have to understand, what I'm describing sounds like some berserk physical activity, and it can be. But I have 90-year-old ladies doing Olympic lifting, okay, after their hip surgery. So it's not impossible for almost anybody to do. You have to get at it gently. You have to do it carefully. You have to do it thoughtfully, but it's still achievable at some level for anybody. And the most important thing is it takes away inflammation, lowers insulin, increased mitochondria. Listen, I just told you a 25 to 35 increase in VO2 is going to reduce your chance for stroke 3.5-fold. I mean, 70% reduction. There's nothing else that's that powerful. So that's an example of the exercise model you want to think about. Yes, sir.
In summary, what you're saying is you want to utilize Hanselli's principles of said specific adaptations to impose demands.
That's it.
I can obviously see that you lift weights. And
Not anymore, but I will, again.
And I have for, I was 16 and I'm 50 now. And
I'm a great-grandfather.
And as a simple example, squats. Mm-hmm. And I mean heavy.
Paradigm example of exercise.
Not girl squats, but barbell weight squats. And doing reps and getting your heart going.
Now, I want to talk about that, by the way. He's absolutely right. By the way, a squat is, we always start with what we call box or chair squats. And most people don't even know how to get out of a chair. And once you get out of a chair right, you're already doing something way better than what you were doing before, even before you put the bar on your back. Now, so the next point of the issue, go ahead.
Also, again, what you're saying is exactly right. Doing that activity, what you're doing with the endocrine system, what you're doing, that is one of the most, well, having sex is another way to do it, but one of the best ways to get your growth hormone levels
That's absolutely right.
Is
Absolutely.
to do heavy,
That's right.
intense exercise at a level where it's going to influence mitochondria and where it's going to tax your endocrine and adrenal.
Absolutely right. Now, the only part I would add, and that's right, absolutely right. One of the things, when I talk to muscleheads, I'll put you in that category, okay? I used to be one myself. I think it's a virtue to be a musclehead, by the way. The part that most muscleheads don't know, and perhaps this guy does, is that we have what's called a gait-based bias in our heart rate response. So when we walk around or run or jog, it preferentially accelerates our heart rate. In other words, the actual physics of the work done, the heart should be responding to its actual energy demands, right? Its actual oxygenation demands and so on and so forth. But it turns out it over responds to gait-based activity. Now, the problem with simply...
G-A-I-T?
Sorry, yeah, gait, yeah, G-A-I-T, I'm sorry, right. Yeah, walking and running. Since we have this gait-based bias, what you really want to find out is train your metabolism to put an appropriate, or heart, put appropriate demand on the heart such that there's a match between the work and the heart rate response. And there's not, most of us don't have that. Has a name, it's called chronotropic incompetence, and it's one of the highest risks for sudden cardiac death there is. In other words, living your life the way most of us live it is training you to die. Because the variability of the heart rate variability, peak heart rate, maximum heart rate, resting heart rate, peak heart rate, recovered heart rate, and variability, and the match between the work done and the heart response, these are dramatically powerful variables. For example, the majority of times the first symptom of heart disease is death. Absolutely right. The majority of times the first symptom of heart disease is death. Well, look at this. If you cannot raise your heartbeat roughly 90 beats within 1 minute of onset of exercise, you have a 6-fold increased risk of sudden cardiac death. If you cannot raise your heartbeat approximately 90 beats per minute within 1 minute of onset of exercise, you have a 6-fold increased risk of sudden cardiac death. That's pretty high. Well, that's far more powerful than lowering your cholesterol 30 points, believe me. Okay, and what's nice about it is it won't make you stupid, forgetful, or no longer interested in sex like the drugs that lower your cholesterol. So it is something you can train for. It isn't something we will all achieve. Keep in mind, I have patients who've had strokes and bypasses and cancer, and they all are doing the model that I've just described for you. Sorry, somebody, yes ma'am. Something's better than nothing is the only answer I have for that. As a rule, I think if people are out for a walk, it should be with their mate, and they should be holding hands, and they should be enjoying the sunset. Otherwise, don't bother. That's and I can back that up, by the way. Yes, sir.
But don't they usually compare the person who walks to the person who's sedentary?
Yeah.
And there's an advantage.
It turns out it isn't even that much there. I mean, look. Again, I've got this guild model. So I'm thinking about public health announcements. 30 minutes a day, it's good for you, blah, 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 blah. I think that's wrong in two ways. Conceptually, to tell somebody the bar, this is high, isn't any more likely to encourage them to get up than to tell them where the real bar is. This is a lie. This is the truth. You may not get that high, but doing something's better than nothing. They set the bar so low it actually doesn't do anything. Several recent studies have looked at low frequency, in other words, as little as 2 to 3 times a week, higher intensity, short interval workouts, and clearly more benefit than the 30 to 60 minutes a day of walking and so on. So I mean, just not even close. So you can even unpack that myth that, gee, I ought to go out for a walk. You should go out for a walk. It's good for your stress level. It's good for, your endorphins. I mean, there's a lot of good things about it, but it ain't going to help you the way they're telling you it's going to help you. That's all I'm saying. No. I would say let me give you some examples. I have guys who travel a lot, for example, and they say, well, I might not be in a hotel with a gym, and I don't particularly care. And they say, well, I said, do they have a stairwell? You'd be better off walking up 8 flights of stairs, walking back down, running or jogging or going as fast as you can up 8 flights of stairs and walking down. Why do you want to walk down? Because that's eccentric exercise. It's not helping you. You got 1 flight, run up, walk down. Do it over and over. That's far more, and do it for 5 minutes. Don't make this hard. The whole point, remember, we're these migratory, hibernating hunter-gatherers. We're supposed to be lying around in the savannah watching the gazelles instead of being one, So think of yourself as kind of sleep and relax, and then do something really intense and important when you do it. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
What are the exercises that you're talking
Well, go upstairs. Go upstairs. That's a paradigm. Stairs are brilliant. They're wonderful.
That's one example.
What?
Is it like some form of weightlifting?
Yes, you can do it more efficiently and effectively with weights than about anywhere. But here it's not, as I pejoratively put it, curls for girls. It's squats, it's deadlifts, it's cleans, it's jerks. It's this pick something heavy up and put it over your head, you know. But again, the problem with those are the very things that are the very best possible thing you can do for your knees and do for your back and do for your neck, done properly. They are also the very things that will injure your knees and your back and your neck done improperly. So that's one of the reasons I'm a big advocate of don't do any of this stuff on your own. Look, Phil's big point is, you know, take supplements, it's cheap and it'll make you live forever. My version is, of course, supplements won't do you any good. You spent your money for nothing. But in any event, this is something you can't do cheap. It's worth spending some money on to get some proper coaching or training, for example. It's worth getting a good database of what everything from your intracellular potassium levels to your extracellular calcium levels are. It's worth doing. Hey, life's pretty important and it's worth living. So spend your money on this stuff. Get some training, but it is large whole body stuff. Compound, ballistic, concentric, closed chain. That's the next part of the story. Closed chain is something that's familiar to most athletes, but a closed chain exercise is the chain that's closed, for example. Now I'm trying to think of it in terms of you go into a gym. Somebody belongs to the JCC or something like that, and you go in the gym and there's all this stuff there. A closed chain exercise is not something you can do on an isolation machine. When I put my arm in there and I do a curl, for example, this muscle is firing, that side of my nerve is firing. But if, for example, I'm grappling with somebody, this side of the nerve is firing, this side of the muscle is firing, this side of the muscle is, in other words, the chain to the brain, to the spinal cord and back is closed. Everything's working. If I do this, that's a closed chain. If I just do that, it's an open chain. Well, that'll take a while, but the idea is there's more neurological recruitment if it's closed chain. And remember, I want neurological, nervous system recruitment, because I want endocrinological response. So you want closed chain exercises, okay? So again, these are largely those crazy guys over in the corner with chalk on their hands, and I don't want to talk to them, but that's where you want to be, okay? My gym is designed for people who never wanted to go to a gym. I've got paneling on the walls and beautiful rhubarb on it, you color it, and I said, no music actually, because I want people to pay attention, you know. But anyway, yeah, there is. That's right. That's great. Does that help clarify the kind of? Okay. All right. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Maasai tribe. They eat a lot of fat.
Yeah. They love the organs.
Well, the reason
they eat the mesenteric fat.
Yeah, but the reason for that is they get tremendous amount of exercise. And from the articles I read, that's the reason why they don't have heart disease, because of the tremendous amount of exercise they get.
A fat apologist told you that. That's not particularly true. Yeah.
I read this, but the other thing is,
you've got to remember the same people that told you should eat 30% fat cited the Maasai. And the original reason was they figured, hey, these Maasai must be eating the muscles. Who would eat the fat? And then they actually started to look how Aboriginal people eat an animal. And the first thing to do is eat the belly fat and then they eat the organs. Exactly the opposite. It was squeamish. We wouldn't do that. So when they usually figured, so in 1972 when McGovern figured we only should have 30% fat in our diet, it was based on poor anthropology. In point of fact, the similar anthropology is mistaken about their exercise levels because it's been looked at across cultures from the Maasai to the Inuit to the Australian Aborigines. Yes, they burn more energy, but their caloric balance is no better. I mean, I know that's literature. I'm sorry.
All the studies I read,
yes, sir.
All the long live societies,
yes.
They get plenty of walking exercise. Every study shows
I encourage walking, notice.
I'm just wondering, where are your studies saying that the walking and the 30 minutes a day exercise isn't the main factor, it's doing nothing, that is the main, what's your theory?
Well, I don't.
What's your factor on this proposition you're giving?
Well, the proposition, now let's be clear, I didn't say walking wasn't good for you. I said it wasn't effective for this caloric balance concept.
Study, though,
the reason, well, okay, well, there's lots of stuff.
I'm biased.
And I do. You don't like to exercise?
I do like
oh, do like to exercise?
So I'm biased.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, my bias on that, as I was a little bit of I mean, I went through a, marathon, Ironman triathlete, 3% body fat, 60 pounds lighter than I am right now, and was far less healthy. So I have apparently not for drugs or alcohol, I have an addictive personality I discovered as a long distance runner. I loved it, so I'm not knocking that part of it. But there's lots of these studies, and I'd be glad to give you some references. And they're probably the best one that was recently studied, where they looked at the specific 30 minutes, 6 days a week, as opposed to 30 minutes, 3 days a week of intense interval studies. That particular study was a JAMA study. It was even put as a CME. This is what I like, because it shows that the intellectual history has changed. It was even a CME course in Medscape, which is just as generic a medical thing available as a matter of fact. I don't even think you have to be a doctor. So go on Medscape and look up intense interval training. They'll give you some references there. Yes, sir. But walking is good for you because it relaxes you. Remember, I wasn't against it. Okay, sir.
One of the things that
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
one of the things that really amazed me when I was looking into some of the alternative literature on fat burning was that when some of the English polar explorers got stuck and stranded, they ended up they ended up developing scurvy and all these vitamin C deficiency symptoms as they were running out of their flour-based, food supply.
Right.
And eventually they stopped eating it and started going into starvation mode and started eating a bunch of fat, and all their symptoms of scurvy disappeared, even though there was no vitamin C in their diet.
Well, you don't need vitamin C. You don't need very much vitamin C. That's another myth.
That's the issue of the
It's insulin. It's insulin. It's insulin. Insulin is an actual competitive inhibitor of vitamin C uptake.
Well, yes, but what I'm saying is that the fat burning mechanism is where you're generating the NADH, which is your primary cellular reductant. So it's recycling your vitamin C. Into
Right,
the diet.
right. But
And these people who eat this level of fat, they're walking around in T-shirts in 0-degree weather, and they're comfortable.
and that's partitioning of energy. You want to understand that. That's why it's not calories plus, calories minus. The hormonal milieu within you determines how your body partitions energy. The NADH is inhibited in the presence of high insulin. Yes, it is a fat-burning mechanism, but inversely inhibited by insulin levels. Go look at one of the modulators. Insulin's a powerful modulator. So as soon as they got off all the sugar, off the flour, their insulin dropped, and boom, they didn't need any vitamin C. We basically don't need very much vitamin C if our insulins are low enough. I know that's heresy here too, but that one I know the biochemistry on. So, yes, ma'am, you had your hand up. Yes. Right. Okay. What she said is the most. That everything I've said hasn't been useful. But I could redeem myself. I could redeem myself if I could show her how to get out of a chair. Is that about it? So yeah, I don't have a chair, but yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, okay. Here, thank you, sir. Oh, okay. Well, again, I'm a weak, sick guy. I've got pneumonia.
So your methods work.
They don't take away all the stress. Again, I'm not advocating the germ theory. This is stress. The primary issue that you'll see most people when they get out, they do this, okay, and then they push off of right. This is practicing to be an old person, is what this is right here. You see, okay, I can get. The goal that you want to do is to keep in mind that there are a series of curves in the spine. The primary curve of the thorax, the primary curve of the sacrum, the secondary curve of the neck, secondary curve of the lumbar. Series of beautiful recurves that create a spring so there aren't large-scale compressive forces across the spine. So you want to respect that. Okay, your head's up, stick your butt out. So I'll put it in a crude way. Head up, chest out, butt out. Feel it in your heels. Okay? Feel it in your heels. Not here. This is where I'm practicing being an old person, right? So I'm respecting the curves of my spine. Head up, chest out, butt out, back locked. Feel it in my heels. And you want to practice that. Get a chair under you and do it 10 times. It'll probably be the best exercise, and this is not personal, but it's one of the best exercises you'll ever do. And it's the fundamentals to do what this guy does, which is squat, 4 plates. All right, 6, whatever. Whole body, ballistic, concentric exercise. If you're really, are you moving the ball and that sort of stuff? You're talking about that kind of rebound, or which one are you talking about? There's several. Well, I'm talking about a trampoline as part of your ball exercises. It can be used in a lot of ways.
It's a small mini.
Yeah. Well, in my gym, we use the rebounder mostly for ball work, to be quite honest with you. There's a way it can lay down and you can jump up and down on it. The problem with that, unless you're careful about back posture and knee and leg posture, jump rope and rebounders used that way can actually cause injury. They have to be used carefully. They can be fine. I tend to prefer what I say, build from the floor. That you want to have somebody really get good working on the floor before they get anywhere else. And thank you, that'll help too. Is that your primary exercise? Do you like that? In principle, it's okay. Yes, sir.
What do you think of liking?
It's okay. It's not very. It doesn't do anything I think I'm interested in. Don't get me wrong. You want core recruitment, core stabilization. You want to lengthen the muscle or shorten the muscle. I mean, the Pilates drill is not without value. But it doesn't fix the mitochondria, and it doesn't really do. It can potentially be a full neurological recruitment. It can be in certain postures and certain stretch positions. But again, you'll notice what I'm telling you is something very unhappy. For 5 minutes, you've got to work really hard. I'm sorry, it's just the end of it. For 5 minutes, you've got to work really hard, and there's no way around it. Yes, sir.
Again, kind of summarizing the physiology behind intelligence.
Right.
You want an exercise that is going to tax your system, endocrine,
Yeah.
respiratory, muscles, joints. You want to do that where it's going to influence the number of mitochondria in the cells. And each cell is between 200 and 4,000 mitochondria.
Some even more, but yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
specifically
Right.
the heart, the
Yeah.
brain, heart, and muscle cells have the high, about 4,000
Yeah.
per cell. And then the less active cells have as low as 200 per
Right.
cell. And you want to do something that's going to influence the metabolic processes where those things are going to be taxed, because you can change the number of mitochondria per cell.
But only doing concentric exercise. Actually, the eccentric studies, the University of Utah's got a great has an eccentric department, and they've actually done scanning electron micrographic studies following biopsies of people who do eccentric exercise, walking. They have fewer mitochondria in their cells. It literally regulates the number of mitochondria in the cell. There's some other fundamental chemistry why this is true. But go ahead.
Putting it simply, if you the mitochondria power plants in cells, and you want to have as much of that power in all your cells in the
Right.
body as possible, you've got to do that.
That's right.
With specific adaptation to impose demand type exercise.
That's right. See what you did? You got us off on exercise. And I've got some stuff to talk about, but absolutely, yes, sir.
I like the statement like that says that we're only as old as our arteries.
Isn't that great?
And I personally, what I like to do is take 4 grams of arginine and 1 gram of crystalline. But I know that you don't support supplements, so my question is,
Yeah.
if I was not to do that, other than
Where are you going to get your nitric oxide?
okay, yeah.
Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, okay.
Hey, I'll tell you how by the way, an interesting thing about arteries. We all tend to think this is some kind of obscure biochemistry. Some of it's simple physics. Shear forces within the artery generate nitric oxide. That is the actual mechanical, electromagnetic trigger to the production of nitric oxide. And so you create as many dynamic transient forces across your arteries as you can, you increase your nitric oxide. So in other words, doing the kind of training and exercise I'm talking about is how your arteries will get better at making nitric oxide. We know, for example, that if you look, I'll be right there, if you look at arteries, where do atherosclerotic plaques tend to build up? They tend to build up at branches and so on and so forth. Why is that? Because those are areas where laminar flow becomes disrupted and they don't have as many transient forces. Now this is physics, this isn't chemistry, this is plain old ain't nothing stretching it right there. And something stretching it right makes a difference in terms of this biochemical downstream effect of nitric oxide production. The funny thing is, with the exception of the adipocytes, the fat cells, and here's the fundamental thought about supplements, you can't make them take what they don't need. You can take all the calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, zinc, and vitamin D you want to, and you won't make bone if you don't need bone. If you need bone, you demand bone. Bone is a piezoelectric material. Again, this is from physics. Shear forces, deforming forces, generate electromagnetic environment that attract the right ions, and then therefore those tissues become, bone mineral density goes up. That's physics, it's nothing else. And so what my point is you got to start thinking about what is the dynamic effect at the vascular level, at the bone level, at the cellular level, because it's the dynamics of that that demand improvement. You can feed your bones all the calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, zinc, and put into the world, and let's have some vitamin D, and vitamin K has a role here, etc., and all this. And bones don't care. If you're sitting at your desk all day and eating bad foods, you're going to have osteoporosis. I don't care how many minerals you take. But if you do the right kind of exercise, you'll make bone, it'll use what you have. Same with nitric oxide. If you don't have enough shear environment in your arteries, I'm really cool, my blood pressure's never up, my heart rate's never over 80, you're not going to make nitric oxide. I don't care how much arginine you take. Now, could it have a transient effect? One of my favorite examples, this guy, Ames, has got this vitamin that he sells people. He says, well, I know that it makes he had a nice little study that showed better motility in sperm by taking these supplements. Well, yeah, it's one little mitochondria driving one little filament, and it doesn't make that mitochondria last any longer. It's just a little available energy. So a lot of these kind of studies are based on, I just don't think they're rich enough or deep enough. And the arginine studies are kind of like that. Sure, you put some arginine in the presence of endothelia, and you're going to make some arginine. For how long, and have you changed the fundamentals of that cell? And the answer is no. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Am I in trouble? Yes, sir.
You're in trouble about the question about the shear at the junction.
Yeah.
Because where you deviate from the lamellar flow, then there are much higher shear forces.
It's right, but they're not organized. It's not this massaging effect. That's correct, yes. But again, if you look at the way that works, there are different forces there, and once you disrupt the laminar flow, you do have a turbulent flow, but you don't have this constant massaging of the artery at that place, or at least that's one of the speculated mechanisms. We don't know the full details of that. But we do know shear forces stimulate nitric oxide production in the endothelium.
So do you have any position on the device which measures the elasticity of the artery?
Well, most of those are, as you probably know, basically a waveform analysis. And so they have a plethysmographic mathematical model of secondary wave fronts and so on and so forth. And I think it's an interesting statistical model. I don't think it probably turns out that, I mean, you know, is yours better today than it was yesterday? Does that mean something? It might. Is it something as a useful reproducible trend in a particular individual? I don't know the answer to that. We've been working with a Dutch firm who's developing a better one of those that simultaneously does, you know, the elastic properties of red cells and oxygen saturation, a whole bunch of other things with that waveform analysis. But I'm not sure that we understand, in other words, the mathematics of that are too complicated to be summarized in all the algorithms I've seen. Yeah, yes sir, ma'am. Sorry. They're great, they're great. It's paradigm exercise, absolutely. She said our push-ups and chin-ups or pull-ups examples of effective exercise. They have all of the elements. They are ballistic, they are closed chain, they are concentric, they're perfect examples. Absolutely right. Yes, ma'am.
One was you said something about exercise
Yeah.
Is there a chart or a website where we can look at these different exercises that meet what you're talking about?
Yeah, I have well, we have videos of these exercises properly executed on our client website. In other words, you go to our website and you sign in and you can see all these exercises performed properly and the dialogue and stuff like that. What I'm trying to do is create enough of a reproducible algorithmic database-based process that I can make this into an application, an online application, so people can upload their blood work and their workouts and their heart rate profiles, and they can see these algorithms that we've generated. I think this ought to be something everybody should have for cheap. Phil and I are on the same page on that. What I'm doing now basically is I'm very fortunate that well-to-do people have funded my research so I could get them healthy and then also do my research. But it should be a cheaper process, but it will not be free, and it shouldn't be. You don't pay to have a rental car washed. You don't. You have to own your body. You have to be responsible for it. You got to spend some money on it. You got to take care of it, and have a good trainer or coach or so on and so forth. But yes, you're right. There should be some more generic thing available. We're actually just now finishing our first book, but it's sort of a market niche book. It's actually a weight loss book, which I'm not much of a fan of weight loss, but it gets into a lot of the exercise physiology and diet stuff about energy partitioning in the body. He was talking about these guys out there in the frozen tundra in their t-shirts because so much of their mitochondria partitions their energy to body heat. Well, your mitochondria, which are the partitioners of this, can decide whether they're going to partition the energy you eat as fat cells, energy, winds up in the toilet, winds up in body heat. That partitioning is under largely hormonal control. And you can control your own hormonal milieu and how your body responds to calories and where it's stored. So where I'm going with that is what he's been doing. What's your name? Douglas. What Douglas has been trying to get me to do is encapsulate this in pretty conventional muscle head speak, and I think it's a good thing to do. But I'm trying to come at it from a little bit more of drawing some ideas together that in a different way. But the point is that the general exercise principles I'm talking about are understood, but the interesting thing about it is they're also validated in the medical literature. This isn't some goofy thing that you read only in strength and conditioning journals. So it is out there, it is available to you. Could I get on the others? Yes.
Well, one, Douglas is a doctor. He has a great presentation of that
Yeah.
in our video. And also I'd like to ask, could you tell us your website?
Yeah, it's the Latin word for time, T-E-M-P-U-S, Tempus Clinic. Clinic. Tempus. Is the Latin word for time. Yeah.
And then the 6-day, 3-day question?
Well, the 6-day issue is that's what the conventional public health advice has been, walk an hour a day, 6 days a week. The most recent study that looked at that just specifically said, okay, let's believe that and let's look at that. And they actually sequentially, not randomized, but either did a half hour a day for 6 days a week of, sub-maximal exercise, or I think there's only 2 in the most part of the study, 2 days of intense interval exercise. And they were looking at triglyceride levels, insulin levels, fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and HDL, and there was just no comparison. The guys that had intense interval training 2 or 3 days a week had far better results than those. As a matter of fact, they used what's called the cardiometabolic syndrome, which is an HDL under 40, triglycerides over 150, a waist over, what was in that group? It was like 40. And and high blood pressure, marginal high blood pressure. And the guys on the 2-day-a-week interval training, virtually all of them no longer met the criteria of the cardiometabolic syndrome within like 12 weeks. It wasn't even hard. Yes, sir.
Right. Ordinarily I would interrupt and tell people not to ask so many questions so you can finish. But the questions seem to be working really well.
Oh, they're great questions.
And I think you're making your case very well.
Okay.
But I think in order to wind up here in a timely way, we ought to give you 10 or 15 minutes uninterrupted at least. Is that okay?
I'm fine. Either way. I love the dialogue. I like to have satisfy people's questions.
Yeah.
I just had some more stuff that might be of interest to you.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No more questions.
Calories consumed plus or minus calories burned equal weight gained or lost. Calories belong in chemistry, not physiology. Fact, hormones decide whether you burn or store, which we've already talked about, burn or store fat. Eating fewer calories can make you fat. The body always makes sense. If you starve the body, it figures you're going to starve, and if its best job is to conserve calories for the future, it turns down your metabolism. We all kind of know that. This explains why some who overeat don't become fat. I used to be in that category, I'm not anymore. Yes, somehow, sorry, I can't do that. Okay, recommendations. Seek practitioners informed by the scientific method and go beyond Gilsman. The scientific method is not something that's obscure. It's very simple. You collect a bunch of data, you control as many of those variables that you've analyzed as possible, you change something, and then you retest it and see what your results are. Everything you do, when you should adopt the scientific method. It's an iterative process. I took a whole bunch of arginine and I feel a whole lot better. That's probably not good science. By the way, I'm a great believer in the placebo effect. So if you have a good placebo effect, don't destroy it. On the other hand, you might want to measure what are my inflammatory markers, etc. I'll go through a list of markers you might want to check. Place yourself within a closed loop testing model. You understand what I mean by that now. Test, inform yourself from original sources, not myths, ideal logs, hunches, or me. Get some sources, okay? Remember intellectual history? It's all corrupted by asynchronous information. Everything's got a different date and a different time, and it's working with a different concept, and they smash it all together as how you're supposed to behave tomorrow. Doesn't work. Okay, secret. In the Guild model of medicine, there is no disease unless we first have a drug to treat it. You guys all figured that one out, right? Well, okay. Which is why we hear about high cholesterol, lipid, but not about the overwhelming importance of HDL. HDL studies are just, the power of HDL as a predictor of your cardiovascular events is independent of your LDL, independent of your total cholesterol. HDL is what matters. And does anybody know about the fiasco with the cholesterol transfer protein inhibitor? I don't know if it was Roche or somebody spent $6 billion on this drug to raise HDL, which it did nicely. Now, the only ominous part of it, you're a little bit more of a fan of conspiracy theories than I am, but one that really made me believe this, I go to the scientific sessions of the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, stuff like this, not every year, but most years. And, so for 20 years I've been hearing how bad cholesterol is and how bad LDL is and how we've got this wonderful drug that'll treat it. And about 4 years ago we started, turns out we were wrong. The statistics really don't show there's that much going on with LDL and total cholesterol. We really have to raise HDL. We've got to raise HDL. I think it was 2 years ago I was at the American Heart meetings. And it was like this emergency meeting, and some of us were called in. Oh my God, the drug didn't work. So all of a sudden they quit talking about HDL. But this study was published, this CTAP inhibitor, $6 billion in R&D, and it did raise HDL. It just killed people, and that actually made it. I don't know if you saw that. It actually made it to the newspapers. So anyway, so you don't hear much about raising your HDL. Yes, sir. Oh, I can't do that. He told me not to. Can you hold it? No. That's right. No. There was an HDL. There was a CTEP separate arm. No, there was a CTEP. There was a CTEP. There was a CTEP separate study, a separate arm to that study. Absolutely right. Why don't we have any CTEP drugs on the market? And you know the answer to that. Recent revelations, correlations and now understood mechanisms of disease and action do not support the conventional wisdom of the Guild approach to the most important kinds of suffering and causes of death. So I give you some old data which shows you that if your cholesterol is under 200 and your HDL is under 40, you're likely to get heart disease. If it's over 60, you're not. And if your HDL is over 260 and your HDL is over 60, you're not. And if it's under 40, you're not. That's a complicated slide, but what it says is HDL matters. Here's another one that came out of New England Journal 2002. This is about 28,000 women followed for 7 years. The open bars are LDL. The black bars are C-reactive protein. These guys were run off the academic stage for the study. But what it basically says, if you look over here at cardiovascular deaths, the lowest quintile LDL, highest quintile LDL, most of the people that died had normal or low LDL. Of course, the people that died that had high C-reactive protein were in the high end here. The other interesting thing in this study is if you look at the number of cardiovascular events as opposed to cardiovascular death, sure enough, the people in the low HDL had fewer events, but the people in low HDL and low LDL actually died. These people had their heart attacks, but they didn't die. It was actually somewhat protective. That's a large study. It was actually designed to show the importance of C-reactive protein, but the real information here is LDL didn't seem to make much difference. We'll talk about CTEPs after a while if you'd like to. Partial list of variables with more statistical power than cholesterol is, in my opinion, you can find these, they're out there. Renal function, LP little a, LDL particle size, amyloid A, cellular adhesion molecule, HSC reactive protein, VO2, white cell count. Now that's a fun one. Your white cell count has more statistical power to predict your risk for stroke or heart attack than your total cholesterol. White count. Why? It's an inflammatory response and so on and so forth. You know the answer. Insulin is probably one of the more powerful one up here over which you have immediate control. Testosterone, that is a little bit vexed. All the studies either show, well, maybe it's not important or it's real important. None of them show it's not important, okay? Or not, it doesn't have a negative effect. Heart rate variability, we talked about chronotropic competence earlier, the match between volume of work and the heart rate response to that. These are all statistically more important than your cholesterol. And these are all things over which you have large control and can fix or change. Testing metrics in a closed-loop scientific methodology. These are things I advocate you find out about yourself because there's something that you can do something about, something that will change your future. And this isn't a maybe. Your VO2, your chronotropic competence. If any of you ever had an EKG stress test, most of the time they don't look at this simple thing that's right in front of them. What's the match between the heart rate and the workload? That's chronotropic competence, and it's a very important predictor. It's something you can measure. Cortisol level. Stress kills. It also causes pneumonia. I can verify that. But it's also a very key thing to think about. If you understand a simple division line, it's just as clear as the aisle in this sanctuary. You're either catabolic, you're tearing things down, or you're anabolic, you're making new stuff. Now, most people have heard the word anabolic and they've heard it associated with testosterone or Barry bonds or whatever. But there are a lot of things. Growth hormone's anabolic. Insulin's anabolic in the right range. It's also catabolic in a different range. You can look at every time you eat, sleep, drink, rest, exercise, listen to music, think about tomorrow. You're either going to do it in a catabolic way or you're going to do it in an anabolic way. Make sure that your behavior is consistently anabolic. If you eat, sleep, drink, exercise, listen to music, have friends, and that other thing he mentioned I won't name. Does anybody remember what that was? Do it anabolically. Okay? Make something new. Make new stuff. The body always makes sense. The body wants to heal. You teach it, listen to it, learn from it, and teach it. You can make it always anabolic. Now that doesn't mean necessarily only testosterone. Most people hear that as a sex talk. It's about how you breathe, how you exercise, how you eat. Okay? Be anabolic, don't be catabolic. Bone mineral density, IMT carotid, pulmonary function. Pulmonary function. How well can you breathe? Very important predictor. Also something over which you can change. Our average 6-month improvement in ventilatory exchange is about 30%. Wow, that's huge. That's how much you can do in 6 months. Coronary artery calcium, we talked to some people earlier about that. Don't chelate your coronary calcium. Calcium is the body's response to injury. Just fix the injury, okay? The calcium will go away. I've got dozens of reversal coronary calcium cases in my patients. Celiac disease, 1 out of 80, 1 out of 100 people. It's associated with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders. Do you have that? I don't know. Do a blood test. These are things that you should check. Iron storage disorders. Hemochromatosis may only occur in 1 out of 250, but an excessive production of ferritin and transfer and absorption, some other things in the gut. A lot of people have too much iron. Find out if you have too much iron, not just serum iron, ferritin levels, etc. You get rid of the iron. Thyroid function. These are all things that you can do as a closed test. For example, your thyroid function can improve If you do what he and I have been talking to you about, your thyroid function will improve, unless it's going to fail, and many of them do nowadays, of course. You want to know these things, and as Professor Miller here told you, you want to track them. You don't want to just know what they are today, you want to know what they are 3 months from now and 6 months from now. Because identifying trends, looking at relationships, unless you have a very unusual non-guild physician, you're going to be better at looking at that and tracking that and knowing what that means than your doc. And that doesn't mean he's stupid. He's smart enough to go to medical school, he's a bright guy, and he cares about your health. But he doesn't do this kind of complex variable analysis, variant analysis, which you can do, and I encourage you to do that. Well, this is another thing looking at relative risk of some other interleukin-6 and amyloid A, and it's probably more complicated than we need to get into. It's just to show you that there's lots of other things. I guess it was the 28th of April I put this talk together, but it doesn't matter. The interesting thing was I started to look up side effects of known medications, and I just pulled off the top of the journal that was sitting on my desk, and they were here. Aldendronate, which is often used, it's a biphosphonate people use for osteoporosis, increase the risk of atrial fibrillation. I'd rather have osteoporosis than atrial fibrillation. Thiazolidine diones for diabetes increases risk of fractures of the hip and wrist. I mean, think about these things when you take your drugs. I do write prescriptions. I believe in medications, but I write them last, not first. So you go in, somebody gets a DEXA scan on your hip and says you have osteoporosis and hands you a drug. I would take that later until you've proven you can't fix it yourself. I would encourage you to have enough motivation to fix it yourself because you can. English study showed that women who took calcium, we talked about that earlier, increased their risk of myocardial infarction, heart attacks. 6 people said it wasn't true and 12 people said it was true. It was an interesting study and it was very powerful, and the physiology makes sense. If you look at the bolus effect of gastrointestinal absorbed calcium and how it affects fast channel calcium and spasms associated more in women than men with myocardial infarction, it makes sense. It's not crazy. So even calcium's been associated with problems. This is just more. This is one of the graphs out of the Lancet study that I talked about in 2007. They used millimoles, but bottom line, who was it that asked for the citation on that? Anyway, does it say the date of the article? Anyway, December of 2007 is the Lancet article. Okay. Where am I? Now I can answer questions. Or you can kick me out of here. It's got to be late enough to leave.
Parents essential oils?
I'm sorry?
Parents essential oils to get the omegas versus fish oil?
Why wouldn't you eat venison? Why wouldn't you eat grass-fed beef? Why wouldn't you have... you don't like being human. I mean, what I mean by that is, here's the problem. Well, that's I can't solve that. My point or claim is this, that nutrients to be effective must be absorbed in a complex environment, because that's how we co-evolved. So you have to eat whole, real food, because the interplay between nutrients has a lot to do with their biological effectiveness. And so if one of the analogy I gave someone earlier is I said, if you want to have a louder orchestra, you don't just add trombones. You want to have that symphony playing nicely together, interrelationships. They have to be taken in their complex interreactive relationships. And so, the Gissy studies did say that looked like if you took fish oil, it had some effect on your heart attack risk. But it'd be better to get them from complex food sources. Now you could, not liking these things, there are some complex food things that, for example, one of the only open questions is whether ginkgo biloba actually does have some benefit. There doesn't appear to be any benefit, but it's an open question, and it's not a contradiction to my point. It's not a supplement, it's a food source. So I guess what I'm trying to get you to think about is, how can I get that in as natural a state as possible? How can I get that in a rich environment, a nutriently complex environment? And if you don't like food, I don't know, I don't have any good suggestions.
No, I just don't like venison and fish.
Well, fish, you like fish, you know about fish. Lamb, you like lamb? Don't like lamb either. You're a crypto-vegetarian, I know.
Female, most of us don't like that food.
Well, lamb, okay. I don't have a good answer. Where I struggle with this most is I have some vegetarians, and certainly we work at how to, I mean, it's possible to live a healthy life as a vegetarian, but the epidemiology doesn't look that good. As you probably know, the largest vegetarian experiment is called the continent of India, and it doesn't work very well. They have a very high incidence of sudden cardiac death, they have a very high incidence of diabetes. Anyway, my point here is, yeah, I think it's got to, I would just think it'd be worth looking at more complex foods. Is this your husband? Oh, okay.
Hey, Mike?
Yes, sir.
Just to set an agenda here. Whoops. Okay.
There was a question over there.
Yeah, I know there's more questions, but.
Yeah, they ought to be freed.
Think about, bringing things to a point.
Yeah.
Now, how about 5 minutes more? Because then we can get out of here within our rental time.
Yeah.
And we can take Ed's question first, and then is that agreeable?
I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And then afterwards, I'm sure, especially if we let him sit down for a while, because I mean, you can imagine how he feels after dealing with polyviral pneumonia, right?
No, it was bacterial. It was
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was actually strep pneumonia. It was a bad one.
Wow. Anyway, so that's the program. So we'll take 5 minutes of questions. Then if people would like to come up talk with Mike, I'm sure he'd be glad to stay a little.
Hey, the guy I went to argue with left. Doggone it.
Chickened out.
Yeah, sir.
Comment about the Taubes book, which I was privileged to read
Right.
in draft before it had a
Right.
title.
Right.
Excellent book, especially for this audience.
Yeah, I think so too.
Goes into the history of
Taubes' book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. Yeah.
goes into the history of
Everyone should read
of
it.
how we got this AMA diet foisted upon
Yeah,
us, and exactly how it's contributed to the obesity and to the diabetes epidemic.
Yeah.
So a real plug for this book.
I agree. I mean, I don't know if you're getting royalties or not, but if you are, I'll go buy another copy because it was a great book. And I've had a kind of, I mean, I actually give it to my patients. The feedback I've gotten is the ones that like it just devour it. The ones that don't just say, oh, I don't care about this stuff, even though they're interested in the point, because Taubes really is making a historical, political commentary as much as he is a scientific one. And I think we need to understand that historical, political point that he's making, and that is the corruption of science by a political agenda. And he does a beautiful job of doing that. And what's interesting is I probably haven't talked to him for a while, but I did talk with him. As you know, he's an East Coast guy. I did talk with him specifically about Gerald Reaven. Gerald Reaven is at Stanford and has done brilliant work characterizing the insulin-resistant syndrome. And so you would think Gerald Reaven would be a big fan of Gary Taubes' work because he's basically showing a mechanism whereby insulin resistance is such a terrible disease. He hates the book. I tried to get them both on the same speaking stage. Gary was up for it, and Reaven, who is usually congenial with me, was no. And it's more politics. What's that got to do with it?
My mind is made up, don't confuse
That's how it's just, well, but it supports his ideas. I mean, I don't even get it. I'm sorry. Yes, sir. You guys are free to go, you know. I mean, he did tell you that, right? I don't want a captive audience. Sorry.
Is there a kind of its most natural state so that I don't, take 5 grams of arginine? That would help.
Do you mean the arginine issue?
Yeah, that would help with nitric oxide. A natural whole food, that would be.
Well, it's a pretty ubiquitous substance, as you probably know. And there certainly are some different amino acid efficiencies from different foods. Sorry? Well, that's what I recommend. Yeah. Matter of fact, I teach my patients to eat nuts 3 times a day. A closed handful. I'm sorry. I teach my patients to have a closed fist of nuts 3 times a day. Preferably almonds, and if they're going to do seeds, I prefer pumpkin seeds. But basically, kind of graze in the nut world. Keep in mind, someone else made this remark earlier, that the most common allergies are grasses, just plain old allergies, forget food allergies. And then add to that the gluten, gliadin chemical in wheat and some of the other grains. And so you want to be a little careful with those. But secondary to grasses, one of the most common allergy groups are tree nuts. Excuse me. So you have to be careful about nuts too. And I don't mean your face swells up, you can't breathe, just low-grade intolerance. But so by the time you figure grasses, you got to be careful with grasses, and you want to watch out for nuts. There's nothing left to eat. That's not true. Try nuts. Nuts are a good source. That's what I teach my clients as a rule. Well, we're talking about amino acid spectrums that come in a good fat environment. I was mentioning nuts.
Coconut.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on Dean Ornish's plan?
Yeah. I think it's wrong. Through and through, top to bottom. He has made, in my estimation, one very important contribution to the practice of medicine. That's his emphasis on the spiritual aspect. I think that is key, and I think that any man should be happy to have made such an important contribution. I think his nutritional ideas are goofy. I know some of the radiologists that read the first angiograms, and I don't believe it. Even his own data showed increased triglycerides at the end of the first year, and all these things which are harbinger of change in LDL substructure and increased insulin resistance. How about the Stanford study? It just came out 6 months ago, where they did a free living comparison of what's that guy? The other guy, the dead guy, Adkins. They did a 1-year study on Adkins, Ornish, ADA, and I think also Zone guy. Yeah, what's his name? And if you looked at it, it was a very interesting study. It was absolutely definitive, both for lipid profiles, in other words, actually an increase in HDL, and weight loss and compliance. It was billed as low carb versus high carb, but in point of fact, it was a high fat versus low fat. And the Atkins people did far better than anybody else. They did, and Ornish did worse than anyone else. And Ornish's remark was, and it's very important, he says, clearly this wasn't true, it was wrong, it had to be wrong, because the Atkins guys consumed over 200 calories a day more. And I just thought, this is a clear example. He doesn't know what he's talking about at some fundamental level, because the hormonal environment allocates the calories, and the hormonal environment of a very high carb diet partitions energy to be stored as fat. And so the reason why they didn't lose weight wasn't because they ate less. By the way, they did have over 200 calories less calories consumed per day on the Ornish diet. They didn't lose as much weight, and their HDL went down. It makes perfect sense once you understand the hormonal impact and environment and effect on each of these other issues. And so, yeah, they 200 calories more than the Ornish people, lost more weight, had higher HDL, had lower triglycerides. This is right out of Stanford. Or that one's almost 2 years ago. This other one was not Greece. Anyway, that was studied at Stanford maybe a year and a half ago. Yes.
What don't you eat?
What don't I eat?
Bread.
Yeah, I'm a functional celiac disease guy. I don't eat any grains. I mean, huh? You know what? I do not have a sweet tooth, so it's not really fair to say that I don't eat much sugar. I was a disappointment to my mother, who loved to bake, and she'd have me bring kids over to eat the food. I mean, so yeah, I don't eat sugar, but I don't care. But I see, the reason why I put it that way is I see what a struggle that can be for people. Sugar is a real problem for many people. What's interesting is once you see the insulin stimulatory incretin ghrelin effect, you will start to understand why sugars make you hungry, sugars make you crave. And it's not because you're crazy, it's because the hormones are designed to create that energy craving. And so a lot of people who have problems with eating behavior, it really does go away when they stop sugars and stuff. Absolutely does. Yes, sir.
My son was in Germany, and So he went to a German doctor, and the German doctor prescribed to him to become a vegan vegetarian. And he said it was the best thing he ever had.
Well, you'll remember earlier I said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt. What'd you say? I didn't hear the last sentence.
I said, unfortunately, I lost him in '94. It wasn't from any food or anything. It was all
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. That would be a horrible thing to experience. Remember I said earlier that starvation cures disease, and veganism is a form of starvation, and it's just not a good long-term strategy. It's very nutrient poor. It clearly has an influence, but it is such a near state of starvation, it can be very helpful for people. I think that can be a very important transitory diet for people. I don't think it's a good adaptive long-term lifestyle. Matter of fact, there's even some states that have criminalized it for infants because it causes failure to thrive. I mean, it will kill a child to be raised as a vegan. So, yes, I can believe that helped him. And on the other hand, I mentioned earlier that if you wired your jaw shut for 2 months, it'd cure everything. Most people have too. And veganism is a little version of that. It's a form, and the reason why starvation cures disease is because, remember I told you that picture earlier, since we're hibernating animals, if you put us in a hibernation state, we clean out all this stuff, we get healthier. Inflammation drops, insulin drops, etc., etc. Veganism is a form of starvation and is effective. But that's also an argument for fasting states for all of us. But I'm glad it helped your son.
He also fasted though.
Yeah, fasting works too.
What do you recommend about fasting?
You know, I remember I confessed the arrogance of advocating ignorance. I have had my own experiences with fasting states and so on and so forth. I do not know how to normalize that as advice. So I don't advise it. That is not to say I don't think it can be helpful. So I'm apologizing for not giving you a good answer. It depends so much on your own biochemistry, your own underlying health, you know, that kind of thing. It's dramatically, fasting is for autoimmune diseases and rheumatoid arthritis is an example of that. Fasting is just amazing. I mean, it's just like turns the disease off. So I think there's a role for it, but that's different than how you incorporate it as a living lifestyle. And the only thing I give as advice as general living lifestyle is to remember, live that anabolic life, not that catabolic life. I'm sorry, that's not a good answer. One of the things I encourage people is to look within their own spiritual discipline. And there's usually a long human history around this. In other words, all world historical religions have adopted fasting in one form or another. And so there's some experiential human experience with fasting. I think it's a good guideline. So, I mean, Catholics have it, Buddhists have it, and you know, it fits. It's a place. It belongs.
And omega-3 on Friday.
That's right. That's exactly. So you're a macro snapper, are you? Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Who? You.
To someone, so, do you mind?
No, you. I was explaining to you.
Oh, thank you. So things like IBDs,
Mm-hmm.
you fasted even though it's a catabolic state.
Yes.
You're saying you can shut it off and it might permanently put it into remission.
It can.
Interesting.
Now again, that very good pickup, by the way. That's clearly a catabolic behavior, and I just advocated, but I also demurred from the notion that I don't advocate fasting as a behavior outside of a tradition, because I think it's an area that can be misunderstood, abused, and so on and so forth. But it's remarkable how effective it can be for an incredible array of diseases. Fasting is a very powerful tool. It's just too dangerous for me to teach or use.
Well, how is it dangerous?
Well, you know what? I'll tell you something. Here's how I'll give you a low-risk example. This goes back probably 20 years ago when I first started telling patients about the fat stuff and that fat wasn't bad for them and so on and so forth. And a woman, I still remember this, a woman said, "You mean cheese isn't bad for me?" I said, "No, cheese is okay." And she came back and she had some particular kind of cheese that she liked that was mostly sodium, and she must have been eating 10 pounds of stuff a day. And she just was horrible. Her blood pressure was through the roof. She gained, it was the right information, but she heard a different thing, right? And this literally was 20 some years ago, and it just kind of taught me. As you can see, I'm pretty open. I tell you what I think, and I probably got mad blunt guy. But there are some things that I just know they're kind of bombs when you give them to people, and fasting's one of those. I haven't eaten in 3 weeks. Well, that's not quite what I meant. So that's why I think it's dangerous. That's why I tie it to tradition, and I tie it to experiential parameters. I don't think there's enough clear research guidelines for me to define it. I think there's clear research guidelines for everything else I've told you.
Okay, last question. Okay, hold on a second. Wasn't there someone over here that deferred? Did you have a question?
No, he's just being gallant.
Okay. Last question, Andrea.
Chelation for heavy metal detox?
Well, the chelation issue came up earlier with someone else, and my remark was this. I didn't think chelation was a good idea if you're trying to chelate coronary calcium or atherosclerotic calcium, atherosclerosis-based calcium, because you're destabilizing a mature atheroma. Absolutely you should chelate heavy metals if you've got it. And again, you're getting clear about where it is. Is it in the hair? Is it in the urine? Is it a post-challenge? You want to do it right. But if you have any indication, I think that's a very good thing to do. But again, that's not a lifestyle. I'm not going to live on chelators. You want to do that there's a clear disease, a clear thing wrong. You've got a clear way to intervene. You've got a clear way to measure that you achieve the goal desired. Always put it back into that iterative scientific process. Don't just kind of, hey, I'm into heavy metals or whatever. I mean, make sure that it's clear. Yes, sir.
Let me ask one more question.
Yeah.
This has been fantastic. Am I right? Now the thing is that this is a group we study.
Yeah.
We want to study what you're talking about. Now,
right.
Can we get access to your PowerPoint slides, or how can we do this? What's the best
I'll send it to you. As far as I'm concerned, you can have copies of these slides. Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Okay, good. And then
I'll send it as a link to you, or something like that.
Maybe we can print out. We can sell it as a.
If it's big money, then let me know. Okay.
Okay. But I tell you, I just want to thank you very much. I mean,
thank you.
How often do you get a coherent alternative view like this? I mean, this is really rare. This is a brilliant presentation.
Thank you,
I'm
sir.
very grateful.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
See you next month at Coverly.